Okay, so before we move on with other topics in this course, let us first refresh about psychological research because in any subject in psychology, research will always be there. So you need to understand once again what is the purpose of psychological research, what are the different types of psychological research, what are the different ways to appreciate your data, to analyze it, and to report it? And what are the strengths and weaknesses of these approaches in research? And how can we relate these approaches into the subject that we are studying in this semester? The primary reason why we are conducting research in psychology is that we want to be more scientific in our approach. Because psychology is a science, it's the study of human behavior and mental processes. We need to support our beliefs, our arguments, the facts about psychology using scientific method. We cannot claim something that is not supported by research. And for us to be able to make something, to make an information credible, it must be formed using a scientific approach. So, if we are claiming something, we are stating something as a fact, but it did not go the scientific method, it did not undergo the scientific method, then we cannot really say that it is 100% believable. Okay, so let us take a look once again about how can we apply scientific method in psychological research, because in this context, scientific method, this refers to the procedures by which scientists conduct research consisting of five basic processes: observation, prediction, testing, interpretation, and communication. There are different ways to test a certain idea, to put something into the test. But at the end of the day, we test something because we have a theory. A theory is defined as a set of related assumptions from which scientists can make testable predictions. So there are a huge number of theories in psychology in different fields such as theories of personality, theories in cognitive psychology, theories in social psychology. When we make a certain theory, we would like to support the theory by testing it in the real world. That's how we are going to know if our theory is correct in its predictions, or is there a need to revise the theory. Because if the theory is not supported by research, then we cannot continue supporting that certain theory. That's why that certain theory becomes obsolete. It is no longer used because we have proven time and time again that science does not support these claims. See, for example, that is the main criticism against the theory of Sigmund Freud. Because a lot of people would say that scientific results are not supporting the idea that people are innately bad and the idea that people are motivated by sex and aggression. That's why a lot of scientists are moving away from the psychodynamic perspective because they claim that it lacks scientific support. Recently, psychodynamic perspective is gaining scientific attention once again. That's why there's a trend right now wherein people are trying to test the claims of psychodynamic psychology once again, because recently it has gained some scientific support. This is also the reason why there are a lot of other theories that have emerged that criticize the views of Sigmund Freud and propose a newer theory that can easily be tested. So from a certain theory, we try to generate hypotheses. A hypothesis is a specific, informed, and testable prediction of the outcome of a particular set of conditions in a research design. So say for example, there is this theory called individual psychology by Alfred Adler. He theorized that people with severe inferiority complex are going to be psychologically unhealthy. So if we can conduct a research about that, what would be our hypothesis? We are going to hypothesize that if your inferiority complex is very high, okay, you feel a lot of inferiority, then we can also assume that your psychological well-being will be low. Okay? If your inferiority complex is high, then we can also assume that you are more likely to score high on depression, anxiety, and so many other things, because that's what the theory says. The theory believes that if you are suffering from inferiority complex, then that will result to negative outcomes. So to test that claim, we made a hypothesis coming from the theory, believing that if you have inferiority complex, then this will be the outcome. Now, the results of our study will determine if the theory is correct or not. Is it accurate? What if we were able to prove that having inferiority complex does not necessarily lead to negative outcomes? Then there must be revisions in the theory. Or perhaps you as a researcher, maybe you have made a certain mistake. So it will raise some questions about the theory and about your research approach. Let's take a look at some more specific examples. Now, are you familiar with person-centered theory, also known as client-centered theory? This was proposed by Carl Rogers. I hope that you're familiar with that theory. Carl Rogers believed that if a therapist show empathy, congruence, and unconditional positive regard, then the condition of the client, of the patient, will improve. That's what the theory says. Now, following the scientific method, we can create a hypothesis. We can state in our research paper that undergoing therapy with an empathic therapist will result to higher levels of well-being compared to a non-empathic one. We can compare two groups. We can make one group undergo therapy under a therapist who is empathic, and we can have one group undergo therapy with a distant, directive, non-empathic therapist. So, if what Rogers is saying is true, then the group exposed to the empathic therapist will improve more compared to the group that was exposed to the non-empathic therapist. So that's how we support a theory using research. Our hypothesis came from the theory, and the results will impact the theory in a way that we can convince people that Rogers' theory or anybody else's theory is accurate, or we can convince people into saying by saying that this theory is not true in this specific context. We will have some more examples later on. This is just an example of how we generate a certain hypothesis from a theory. To test the hypothesis, scientists make use of established research methods. So these are some of the research methods that we use in psychology. First, we need to think about the design of the study. Are we going to design an experiment, or are we going to design a correlational survey? How many conditions in the study will be present? Single group, two groups, three groups, four or more groups. It's up to you. In this example, you can make an experiment about a happy group and a frustration group. Then you will look at the differences in the well-being of the happy group and the frustration group. So there are two conditions in this example. And lastly, another established research method is the tool that we're going to use. When we speak about the tool, this can be a scale, a test, a questionnaire, a method, an interview guide, etc. So sometimes we just borrow these tools from foreign researchers, or sometimes we make our own tools. I mentioned earlier that in order for us to measure something, we use tools such as a test, a questionnaire, an interview guide, behavioral observation. There are so many ways to measure a psychological construct. Say, for example, if you would like to measure anxiety after looking at a spider, then you can ask them to fill up a questionnaire on the scale of 1 to 10. How afraid are you of the spider? Okay? But this is not the only way to measure their anxiety, their phobia, but you can also measure their anxiety by observing them. Did he or she become more afraid after being exposed to the spider? Was there a significant change in the behavior? Or you can also measure heart rate or blood pressure. Was there an increase in these um, biological aspects? So there are different ways to quantify something. We as researchers will decide which specific tool are we going to use in order for us to measure a certain variable. Okay? Now, here's the rule of thumb in psychology. You can propose a very interesting topic. However, it would be very difficult for you to pursue that topic if in the first place there's no way to measure it. Say, for example, as Filipino researchers, it would be hard for us to measure Filipino values, such as the value of hiya or utang na loob. Why? It's because there are no established tests existing, as far as I know, that measure these values. So if you would like to measure these Filipino values, then you need to create your own test. Or you can try to adapt something similar to that, a test that measures something similar to that variable. Say, for example, there are researchers who adapt the Chinese value called loss of face to measure the Filipino value called hiya. So that may work at certain circumstances, but not all the time. Okay, but anyway, in order for you to convince your readers that your approach is scientific, there are two properties, psychometric properties, that we look at, and these are reliability and validity. Between the two, the more important one is validity. Which is more important in the long run? It would be validity. The relationship between the two is like this. All valid tests are reliable, but not all reliable tests are valid. Okay, so now you will have more of this when you study psychological measurement or psychological assessment or psychological testing, but as an introduction, in the context of research, a reliable tool is a consistent tool. It means that if today you are extroverted according to the test, then 10 days from now, 2 weeks from now, you should still be extroverted. If today you appear that you're extroverted, but tomorrow you are introverted, then we can say that there's something wrong with the tool. It is not reliable. The answers of the people changes quickly. We do not want that kind of measure. We want it to be consistent. If the test says your intelligence, then after 10 days, you should still appear intelligent or smart. Okay? If the test will say that you are generous, then after 6 months, you should still be generous, with all things being equal. Because it is also possible that you became less generous because of other circumstances. Okay? So If you change from being generous to being not generous, then it does not say something about the test, it says something about you. Okay, but right now what we're talking about is the property of the test. A good test should be consistent, a good test should be reliable. It should not change quickly, it should be consistent. Okay, and there are different ways to prove the reliability of the test, okay, such as Cronbach alpha, test retest, parallel forms, etc. Consistency of score. However, if a test is a reliable test, it doesn't mean necessarily that the test is valid. Because for us to say that a test is valid, a test should be able to measure what it is supposed to measure. What do I mean by that? A reliable test can be consistent, but there's a chance that it is not measuring what you really want to measure. Okay? Then, if that happens, the test is consistent, but it is consistently wrong. We do not want a test that is simply reliable. We also want a test that is valid. So in order for us to say that the test is valid, then if the title of the test is intelligence test, it should really measure intelligence, not other things, such as being hardworking. Okay, the question should be about intelligence. If it claims to measure depression, then it should not measure something else. It should be about depression. It should not measure psychosis. It should not measure eating disorder. Say, for example, you always score high in a depression test. They just call it a depression test. However, as an expert, when you take a look at the item, you inspect it one by one, you realize that it does not really measure depression. It measures eating problems. So, yes, it is consistently saying that you have a problem when it comes to eating, but it does not necessarily measure depression. So, why is it that in that context, it appears that you are depressed? It's because eating problem is also a part of major depressive disorder. So you need to be conscious about these things. Okay, anyway, you will have more of this when you study psychological assessment, but the main idea here is this. A reliable test is a consistent one. Okay? You get the same score, or if not the same, you will get a similar score if you take the test once again in the future. A valid test is a test that measures what it is supposed to measure. In other words, it does not measure something that is not included in what you're trying to measure. In the next few slides, I will have some more examples. Between the two boxes that you can see on the screen, which is valid and which is not. So if we are going to lengthen the sentence, what we're asking here is, which of them measures what they are supposed to measure? So first, you need to ask yourself, what is it really that I want to measure? You want to be specific. So the teacher wanted to measure how much you understood Freud's theory. So that's the main idea of the exam. The teacher want to measure how much have you understood the theory of Freud. So teacher A made the following questions. What are the two drives according to Freud? What are the three levels of mental life? And finally, this is known as the mother of all defense mechanisms. So, ask yourself, does it measure understanding of Freud's theory? Before I answer that, take a look at the questions of teacher B. So the questions of teacher B goes like, who are the parents of Sigmund Freud? What are the societies established by Freud? Freud was blank years old when his younger brother died. Both of them talk about Freud. But which is more valid, the questions of teacher A or the questions of teacher B? I hope that you answered the questions of teacher A. Why? Both of them talk about Freud. However, what we're trying to discuss here is, what we're trying to measure here is understanding of Freud's theory, not his life, okay, not his biography, but specifically we are measuring how much have you understood his theory. Therefore, the questions of teacher B is not appropriate. The questions of teacher A are the questions that measure what you are trying to measure. Okay? So let me go deeper into the relationship of reliability and validity. If you are good in this subject, then you will be able to answer the questions of both teacher A and teacher B. Let's stick with teacher B. If you're good about if you're good about Freud's biography, then you will consistently get a high score on the question of teacher B. However, it does not necessarily mean that teacher B was able to measure your understanding of Freud's theory. Okay, that is an example of a test that is reliable but not valid. So in summary, the questions of teacher A is both reliable and valid. It is consistent. Okay, if you were able to get the same score after 10 months, at the same time, it measures what it is supposed to measure. If you take the questions of teacher B and you get the same scores after 1 year, then it is reliable. However, you have to ask yourself, does it really measure what teacher is trying to measure? Okay? Maybe the question of teacher B will be valid if the test is all about the life of Freud. Okay? So that is an example of how do you choose the best tool for your research. Okay? Next. So after you gather data, you will use the tool, you will give your questionnaire, you will observe, you will measure a lot of different constructs or variables from so many people, then you are now ready for your data analysis. Scientists make use of statistics to interpret the results and determine whether they are significant or not. So what are the examples of research questions that we can answer? For example, does vaccine A really prevent having disease XYZ? So we can answer that with data collection and statistics. Next, do positive emotions result to higher flourishing? Flourishing means psychological growth, psychological development, okay? The negative emotions. So you will compare, you will use comparative statistics to look at the differences between those who experience positive emotions and those who experience negative emotions. There should be a difference between the two. So if there's no difference between psychological growth or flourishing between those who experience positive and those who experience negative emotions, then you cannot claim that positive emotions result of flourishing. But if you are able to find greater amount of flourishing among those people who experience positive emotions, then you can claim that positive emotions lead to greater flourishing compared to negative emotions. Last, does the experimental manipulation influence how participants answered the question? So for example, I measured your degree of anxiety now. Then you did not expect that I'm going to show you a picture of a spider. That's my experiment. That's my experimental manipulation. Then after that, I'm going to measure, did your anxiety increase after I showed a picture of a spider to you? Okay, so we answer these research questions using statistics, using the data that we have gathered. Now, after you analyze your data, then you draw conclusions, then you need to be able to communicate your results to people. So people must know about what's the result of this certain study. They need to be able to understand what are your contributions to science. And we do that using the following methods. So you can publish your research in a scientific journal. So there are a lot of journals that you can see online. For example, Journal of Positive Psychology, Journal of Cognitive Psychology, Journal of Psychotherapy, Journal of Anxiety Disorders, Current Psychology, Journal of Educational Psychology. So there are a number of journals wherein they publish research under the umbrella of psychology. You can also present your paper in conferences. You can use research to teach in class. So for example, you became a professor in psychology, then you can use research that you can see in the book or you can see online in journals so that you can stress a certain idea, you can make a point. And lastly, and most importantly, research sometimes it leads to replication. So when we say that a research is being replicated, one example of that would be I saw an interesting study done in the American context. I'm going to try the same study in the Filipino context. I'm going to see if there will be certain differences because of the context, or will the results stay the same? So there are some who are concerned about replication crisis in psychology. They're saying that some of the most important um, psychological discoveries that we've had back then was not replicated in the present. So replication will improve the credibility of the results of your paper. So that's it. Now, so in other words, here's the research process. First, you observe what is the construct that I would like to measure. Then you try to predict, you try to make hypothesis, and then you try to test that hypothesis. And after you gather data, you interpret using your statistical analysis. Then finally, you communicate the results of your research. So some important terms in research in psychology, the research design, how do you plan to conduct your research? Is this going to be experimental, observational, correlational, etc.? So you need to identify your specific variables. What is it that you're interested in? So a variable is anything that changes or varies across persons such as age, gender, weight, intelligence, anxiety, extroversion, so many things. Population, the entire group that the researcher is interested in. You need to identify them. Is this research about students? Is this about adults? Is this about women, men, etc.? Because we cannot get the entire population, we get a sample coming from that population. Now let's take a look at the different designs in research that you need to be familiar with. First, there are what we call descriptive studies. Okay, these are study designs in which the researcher defines a problem and variable of interest, but makes no prediction and does not control or manipulate anything. So, unlike experiment, you're not manipulating anything, but rather you're simply reporting what you get. Okay, so that can be in the form of a case study. So typically, psychologists make use of case studies wherein they try to observe a certain person for a long period of time. Let's say, for example, in the span of 2 months, did this person improve or did this condition decline after using a certain kind of therapy? So this will help us understand, say, for example, your research question is, does cognitive behavioral therapy, is it helpful for Filipino schizophrenics? So try to observe the same person for 2 months, then see if the condition of the person will improve or decline in 2 months. That can be an example of a case study. Next, we can also do naturalistic observation, wherein you just look at people in a natural setting without being able to manipulate anything. Then you observe and record their behavior. Say, for example, how do children behave when they are in a public place like a park, or how do people behave in a cinema? So that is a naturalistic observation. You're not trying to manipulate anything. Okay, the people don't know that they are being observed. And a survey can also be descriptive in a way that you ask people about a certain idea, then they express agreement or their agreement or support of that certain belief using a tool or a scale wherein they have to rate from 1 to 5. Do you agree or disagree with this certain idea? So the difference between survey in descriptive designs and in correlational designs is that in descriptive, you do a survey, but you're not necessarily looking at the relationships between the variables. Say, for example, you're just observing one variable, which is anxiety during the time of an epidemic. Okay, so that falls under survey in the descriptive design. Now, let's take a look at other research designs. So, in summary, this is what descriptive design is talking about. You're only dealing with one variable. Okay, so you can take a look at this example on the screen. So here are the different ways to do it: case study, observation, survey, interviews, qualitative research. And then the best settings to use this kind of study, okay, you may use this study to find patterns that might lead to predictions. However, the limitation of this study is that there are certain hypotheses that cannot be tested because you're just observing one variable. You cannot really establish cause and effect, particularly because you did not manipulate anything, you did not change anything in the environment. The behavior of the people may not be due to something that you have identified. For example, they may be nervous not because of the epidemic, but because of something else, maybe because something happened in their respective lives. Okay, so you cannot look at the cause and effect relationship between the variables. On the other hand, a correlational study deals with two or more variables. For example, is sugar consumption related to increased activity levels in children? So right now you're dealing with two variables. You are looking at the relationship between sugar consumption and activity levels. This is useful when there are difficulties in trying to manipulate a certain variable. See, for example, instead of making children consume more sugar, then you can simply ask their parents about the level of sugar intake that their children are consuming every day. You can ask them which type of foods do they eat and are they more active at home because of that by doing a survey. The main limitation of this is that there are some correlational there are some variables in a correlational study that you cannot directly manipulate. It would be unethical if you are going to force 10 or more children to consume more sugar because they are going to be unhealthy. Okay, so there are some ethical concerns about that. Now, the weakness of a correlational design is that you cannot establish a cause and effect relationship between variables. In a correlational design, you're saying that when variable x increases, variable y may also increase. However, we cannot say that y increase because of x, because there may be some other things that influences the relationship. Say, for example, you correlated the number of times that a person went to the cinema and the length of their lives, their age. Then you concluded that the more that you go to see that the more that you go to the cinema, the longer your life will be. Well, not necessarily, because there may be some other things that influences the length of the life of the person who goes to the cinema. So for there are other things, such as when you go to a cinema, that increases your positive emotions, and then positive emotions lead to longer lives. That can be one possible explanations, but you fail to take that into account when you were doing your correlational design. So the only way to establish a cause and effect relationship is by doing a psychological experiment. In correlation, we're taking a look at the certain number, a certain statistic called a correlation coefficient. So a correlation coefficient is between -1 to +1. If the correlation coefficient is greater than 1 or less than -1, then there's something wrong in the computation. So how do we interpret this? In correlation, if the relationship is 0, that means that there is no relationship between variables. Okay, next, as the correlation approaches 1 or -1, it means that the strength of the relationship is stronger. Okay, so a correlation of 0.2 is weaker than a correlation of 0.8. Okay, the 0.8 correlation is the stronger one between the two. On the other hand, a correlation of -0.9 is stronger than a correlation of -0.1. Meaning, when we interpret the strength of the relationship, we do not look at the signs, we disregard the sign, we disregard if it's positive or negative. What we're looking at is the value. Is it closer to 1? So if the value is closer to 1, then it means that the relationship is stronger. So a correlation of 0.95 is stronger to a correlation of 0.30. If the correlation is exactly 1, then that is a perfect correlation. So there are two directions, positive and negative. If the direction is positive, then it means that as x increases, y increases as well. For example, your height and your weight, that's a positive correlation. An example of a negative correlation, on the other hand, would be number of therapy sessions and anxiety levels, because in a negative correlation, as one variable increases, the other decreases. So the more therapy sessions that you have, the lower your anxiety levels would be. Okay, so those two are negatively correlated. Okay, so one weakness of correlational design is that, like what I told you, correlation is not causation. It does not establish cause and effect. Other than that, there might be other variables in the relationship that you fail to take into account. Say, for example, we tend to attribute hairiness, being hairy, with aggression. So if you meet a bearded person, then you might conclude that this person is aggressive. However, you fail to take into account that there is another variable that influences the two. It's not hairiness that makes a person aggressive, but rather there's another variable. And in this context, that would be the male hormones or the testosterone. So if you have a lot of male hormones, then you are more likely to be hairy. At the same time, you are more likely to be aggressive. Okay? In this context, that is what you call a mediator, the variable that bridges the connection between an IV and a DV. There are some researchers who do not include mediators in their research. Hence, they miss out on possible connections between IV and DV because they fail to take into account some possible mediators. Okay, so what type of questions does correlation answer? It answers the questions such as, is one variable related to another variable? Is X related to Y? Okay, so to measure that, we're going to give out a questionnaire. This is most useful when we are unable to manipulate things. Say, for example, is gender correlated with aggression? So we cannot manipulate gender. I cannot make a certain person male or a certain person female because that's naturally occurring. We cannot manipulate a person's gender, so we just correlate gender with variables. The weakness of a correlational design is that it cannot look at cause and effect relationships. Next, we have what we call an experimental design. So an experimental design is the only type of study in psychology that establishes a cause and effect relationship. So there are so many people that claim that they do experiment. However, not all experiments are considered true experiments. So according to our reference, in order for us to call something a true experiment, the following criteria must be present. First, there must be experimental manipulation. So if you fail to manipulate, then that will no longer be a true experiment. So going back to the example earlier, actually, you can still use gender as a variable in experiment. However, that will no longer be a true experiment because you cannot manipulate gender. That's what we call a quasi-experiment. Okay? If one of these properties is missing, such as there's no manipulation or there's no randomization, that's no longer a true experiment. That's going to be a quasi-experiment. So an example of quasi-experiment would be who have longer attention span, male or female, because we cannot manipulate their gender. Okay, so now, what is an example of a true experiment with regards to manipulation? So, group 1 will experience a positive emotion by looking at a comedic film or movie. Group 2 will experience sadness by viewing a sad film. So, we're going to look at after this certain manipulation, who are more likely to report things like happiness, okay, who are more likely to report flourishing, etc. Okay, now in order for an experiment to become a true experiment, there must be random assignment. Okay, of course, we cannot do random assignment with gender. We cannot randomly say that I'm going to assign you to the male group, I'm going to assign you to the female group. Okay, so that makes it quasi once again. A true experiment allows for random assignment. You can be in any group. You have equal chances to be in any group in research. So you can be in the happy group or you can be in the sadness group. Okay? So that eliminates the effect of variables that we do not want to measure. So randomization help us to be more scientific in our approach. Here's an example of absence of randomization. We're trying to look at who are better in mathematics. However, in your setup, one group is composed of highly intelligent students and the other group is composed of average students, then that will automatically be advantageous for the group that is composed of high achievers. So there was no random assignment. So in order for you to have random assignment, then the group should be composed, there should be a the group should not only be composed of a certain characteristic, but rather in one group there can be average students, there can be below average students, there can be achievers, etc. So by definition, an experiment is a research design that includes independent variables, and random assignments of participants to control non experimental groups or conditions. So this is not to say that only experimental design uses independent and dependent variables, because these are also present in other designs, except in descriptive, because in descriptive there's only one variable that we're dealing with. So in a correlational study, there are also independent and dependent variables. However, what makes it unique in experimental psychology is the fact that there is more emphasis in manipulation and randomization. So the outcome of our study will depend on our manipulation of these independent variables. So what type of emotions did they feel in your experiment? Did they feel happy, thankful, guilty, sad? So that can be your manipulation, and then you're looking at the outcome. So if I make you happy, which part of the brain activates, which part of the brain shows greater activity. If I make you sad, which part of the brain is involved? If I make you anxious, in which part of the brain are we observing some sort of activity? Okay, so that makes it an experiment. The outcome or the dependent variable is highly reliant on how you manipulate your independent variable. Now, here are some examples of topics from various fields in psychology that we can consider as independent variables and their outcome variables. One would be the number of people present in the certain situation. Does it affect the likelihood of helping someone in distress? This came from social psychology. There is what we call bystander effect. And what is that talking about? When we say bystander effect, this is the phenomenon we're in when there are many people in a situation wherein someone needs help. There is a tendency for a person, there's a tendency for someone to refrain from helping because of the idea that there are so many people in this situation. Why would I help if there are other people who can help? So we can investigate bystander effect in different situations. Of course, we can try to pretend that is someone needs medical attention, someone needs different types of attention in different scenarios. We can manipulate how many people are going to be present in that hypothetical situation. So our manipulation will be the number of people in a situation, and then how does that impact the intention of a person to help. Okay, now let's take a look at the second example. Does hours of sleep influence performance on a test? So this can be in cognitive psychology. This can be in related fields to cognitive psychology. So we can manipulate the number of hours that a person is sleeping, then observe if there will be an increase or decrease in his or her scores. Okay. And from psychotherapy, let's take a look at this. Does relaxation technique, so that's from therapy, crossover with biopsychology or biology, that will also count. Does that impact blood pressure? So that's why relaxation technique is one of the most common techniques used in therapy, because relaxation allows you to lower your blood pressure, lowers the impact of anxiety to your decisions. It allows you to think more rationally. So you can test these variables in an experimental condition. You can try to expose one group to an anxiety producing scenario and then help them learn some relaxation techniques. On the other hand, you can expose one group to an anxiety provoking scenario, but you're not going to teach them relaxation techniques. And then you're going to observe which among the two groups were able to conquer their fear in the long run. So that can be another possible topic to pursue in this umbrella. Okay, so here are some other things that makes it an experiment. First, there must be random assignment, like what I mentioned earlier. There must be an equal chance of joining any group in the experiment. So if we're dealing with gender, if we're dealing with age group, it's difficult to do random assignment because we cannot assign anyone at any age group that we want. Okay. On the other hand, if we're going to assign a person between two groups of happiness group and sadness group, we can easily assign them randomly in that situation. So you need to think about how are you going to group your participants? Is random assignment possible? If random assignment is possible, then that makes it closer to an ideal experiment. And here are the conditions in an experiment. Of course, there should be an experimental group. When we say that a group is an experimental group, it means that this is the group that will receive the treatment. For example, they will receive the new dopamine enhancing drug. So they're the experimental group. It's good that in an experiment, we have a control group. The control group, most of the time, they will not receive any treatment. So if one group will receive a dopamine enhancing drug and the other group will not, we can observe if will there be an increase in dopamine activity in the different parts of the nervous system, certain parts of the brain. Because if there's no control group, then how can you conclude that those who receive that drug has more dopamine in their nervous system, right? So they're going to be the control group, the group that did not receive a treatment. Another important thing in an experiment is the presence of a placebo group. So a placebo group is a group that will receive a substance or treatment that appears identical to actual treatment but lacks the active substance. For example, you're going to convince them that I'm giving you this pill and this will enhance your dopamine, but in reality, it doesn't have any effect. So it's a placebo pill. You're in the placebo group. So the idea here is that you want to be able to establish that what makes what changes the activity of the person is not the expectation that he or she is going to receive a certain treatment or pill. You don't want the result to be purely psychological. You want to establish that there really is an effect by showing that the treatment group is different from the placebo group. You will see more examples of these when we get to the actual topics that we are going to discuss. And ultimately, in any study, not just an experimental one, we need to take into account the confounding variables. So when we say confounding variables, these are variables that influence the dependent variable, but they cannot be separated from the independent variable. So that may be a technical definition, but in simple terms, confounding variable will somehow ruin your setup. It ruins the expected relationship between the IV and the DV by adding something else that you're not interested in. For example, you would like to understand if people are more focused when they study in the afternoon. However, in your sample, you notice that they are less focused because they're sleepy. Not because all people are sleepy in the afternoon, but you just discovered afterwards that your participants just had their lunch. So if you just had your lunch, then there's a high tendency that you will be sleepy afterwards. But that's not the focus of your study. However, it played a role in your analysis. It ruins your setup. You're not interested with that variable. However, it continues to impact your experiment. So that's why we do what we call pilot testing. When we say we are pilot testing, we are trying to administer our experiment with some volunteers before we do our actual experiments. The advantage of pilot testing would be it allows you to anticipate and correct possible errors that may come along the way while you are conducting your experiment. So if an experimental study does not attain randomization, you are not able to manipulate your variables, then that's what we call a quasi-experimental design. A quasi-experiment is a research method similar to an experimental design, except that it makes use of naturally occurring groups rather than assigning subjects to groups. So for example, children versus adults in singing, children versus adults in frontal lobe activity. So we are not randomizing the groupings, but rather we are using naturally occurring groups. Here are some other things that may impact your experiment results. So some experimenters are guilty of this phenomenon called experimenter expectancy effects. So an expectancy effect, it happens, it's a result that occurs when the behavior of the participants is influenced by the experimenter's knowledge of who is in the control group and who is in the experimental group. Say, for example, I'm going to give online classes to my experimental group while I'm going to give face-to-face classes to my control group? My hypothesis is that people will think that online classes will be more effective during the time of a pandemic. Now that I know who my participants are, there's a tendency for me to think that the people in the experimental group are behaving in the way that I want them to behave. Sometimes our expectations as a researcher will make our conclusions bias. Okay? We are not being so objective because we know who belongs to which group. Okay? Not all the time the bias comes from the expectancy effect. Sometimes the bias comes from, or the errors come from the side of the participants. Because in an experiment, there's also what we call demand characteristics. Sometimes, without us knowing, we give subtle unconscious cues to the participants as to how they should behave in the role of a participant. So, since that you know that this group will be in the online classes group, you tend to be more accommodating to them. Sometimes you say very good to them to reinforce what they're doing. You're not so aware of that. And then these participants will continue behaving that way because they know that they are being observed and their behavior is being reinforced. So how can we eliminate these expectancy effects and these demand characteristics? Sometimes what other experimenters do is that they hire volunteers or they hire research assistants. Instead of the researcher himself doing the experiment, they allow their research assistant to do their experiment because their research assistants have no knowledge of their hypothesis. Hence, they will not be biased in their observation. Sometimes they do not know who belongs to which group. So they will not behave in a certain way that will confirm your hypothesis for you. They will be more objective in their methods, in their approach. Okay, here are some concrete examples. In a single blind design, a single blind study, the participants do not know the experimental group to which they have been assigned. Okay, so in a single blind study, the participant will not behave in a certain way because they don't know if they are in the experimental group, placebo group, or control group. How can you do this? Perhaps instead of telling them that you are in the experimental group or you're in the control group, why don't give them numbers? You're going to go to group 1. You're going to go to group 2. They don't have an idea what group 1 and group 2 means. Another way to ensure the objectivity of our study is to conduct a double-blind study. When we say double-blind study, these are studies in which neither the participant nor the researchers administering the treatment know who has been assigned to the experimental or control group. The participants do not have an idea if they are in the experimental or control group. At the same time, the researchers conducting the experiment do not know if you are in the control group or experimental group, so that there will be less bias in judgment of the behavior, so that you will not be biased, you will not confirm your hypothesis ahead of time, but rather you will be more objective in the way that you rate scores, you rate your participants, etc. So in summary, an experimental study answers these types of questions. Does the IV cause the dependent variable? So it answers cause and effect. Do smiles with raised eyebrows versus those without lead to more interaction? Does it lead to more dates? Does it make you appear more romantic? Okay, in perception research. So the most suitable method for answering this question is to do random assignment. Okay, to do it in a controlled condition, meaning that's inside the laboratory. It's hard to do an experiment outside the laboratory because the events happening around you may influence the behavior of the participants. Third, this is best done when you would like to establish cause and effect. However, the weakness of this is that some results of an experiment cannot be seen in the real world. In other words, what is true inside the laboratory may not be true outside the laboratory. So that's the criticism with with experimental studies, according to some experts. Some other advanced forms of studies, you can also do a longitudinal design. So when we say that your study is longitudinal, it means that you observe the same participants for a long period of time. For example, does IQ of 100 children increase in a 15-year period? So that takes a lot of effort because you need to keep up with the same 100 children for the next 15 years. And there are a lot of successful longitudinal studies in the history of psychological research, and they contribute a lot to what we know about psychology in the present. Now, you might also be familiar with some research using the twin adoption studies design. So why do we do twin adoption studies? Okay, so are you familiar with the nature versus nurture debate? In layman's term, when we say nature versus nurture, nature refers to the impact of biology. The traits of your parents passed down to you. That's nature. When we say nurture, that's the impact of your environment to you. Okay? So, how do we say that something is biological and something is environmental? For example, having schizophrenia, a psychological disorder, is that biological, environmental, or both? Most of the time, both. However, there are instances wherein we say that this is more biological than environmental, or this is more environmental than biological. Then, how can we establish those arguments? This is why we take a look at twin adoption studies. Twin studies allow us to establish that a certain condition is biological. In a twin study, by definition, this is defined as this is a research into hereditary influence on twins, both identical and fraternal, who were raised apart and who were raised together. Okay, so what do we mean by this? If two, if a pair of twin will be separated, and then after 10 years, they have the same characteristics. So different parents raise these two. Okay? But they're still twins biologically. When they grow up, they're similar. So what can we say about their similarity? Is their similarity due to environment or is it due to biology? It's due to biology. Why? Because even though we were able to separate them, they're still very similar. Then what is it that explains their similarity? Then it's their genes. Okay? Because they could have been different if their behavior or personality was shaped by the environment because they were shaped by different parents. However, even if they are separated, they remain the same. Then it means that biology played a huge role in forming their personality. Okay, so let's take a look at some specific examples. Okay, so let's take a look at this. Here are 4 hypothetical situations in a twin adoption study. Okay, so here's the first condition. Okay, 100% identical twins, and then they are raised apart. And then they end up to be highly similar. Then the conclusion is that they're similar because of strong biology or strong genetic influence. Second possible conclusion, they are identical twins. They are raised apart, however, they end up being very different. One person became aggressive, the other twin did not become aggressive. Then what is our conclusion? Our conclusion will be aggression is not due to their genetic makeup. Because if it's due to genetic makeup, both of them will become aggressive, right? However, even though they're twins, only one of them became aggressive. So what shaped their aggression is the environmental influence. Now, let's take a look at the third situation here. What if we have two siblings? They're not brothers, they're just two adopted siblings. Okay? Two different two different person from different parents raised together in one home. So their genetic similarity is 0% because they came from different sets of parents. Then they are raised together. What if two people from two different sets of parents are raised together and then they end up being the same? So why are they the same? Is it because of environment or is it because of biology? We cannot say that it's because of biology because they have different parents. So what makes them similar is their environment. Okay, so I hope you can follow the different possible conclusions and how we were able to draw these conclusions. Here's the fourth possibility. What if you have two adopted siblings, two persons from two different sets of parents, then you raise them together, and then they are their similarity is very low, they end up being different. Then if two persons who are not brothers raised together, then they end up being different. That's because of their biology. They're different because of their biology. We cannot say that they're different because of their environment because they grow up in the same place. Okay, so that's how we explain different variable in psychology from the nature and nurture perspective. So if you want to claim that having a bipolar disorder is genetic, then you should observe identical or fraternal twins. Okay, and see if both of these people will develop bipolar disorder when they grow older, even if they are raised in different environments. Another research technique is a meta-analysis. So when we say that a study is a meta-analysis, it means that this researcher did not gather his own data, but he did something more complex than that. He gathered different research papers. And then he gathered the data sets of these different research papers, combined all of them, and then he did one analysis on all of those. So, for example, if I'm interested in visual acuity in 20 countries, then I will ask data from 20 different papers from 20 different countries, and then I'm going to analyze it and make one paper about visual acuity, visual perception in 20 countries and look at their differences. That is a meta-analysis. So if you're doing your thesis or research, it is advised that you look for meta-analysis because a meta-analysis will be able to show you differences in how a certain culture, how a certain place experience a psychological construct. It will tell you what are the areas of improvement in research. It will tell you the status of research in a certain country. It will tell you if there's no research done yet in your country. So you can look at a meta-analysis of American studies, then see if that will remain true if you do the same study in your own country. Okay. So let's see how our biases as a researcher will affect our conclusions and our analysis of the data. By taking a look at this example, the study by Rosenthal, he hypothesized that people who are successful are more likely to see success in other people and the other way around. If you think that you failed, then you're going to rate others as less successful as well. So how did he manipulate this variable in his research? So basically, he split a sample into two groups. He told one group that you guys are successful in this intelligence test, while he told the other group that they perform poorly on the intelligence test. Then after that manipulation, he showed pictures of random people doing various tasks like studying or playing sports, etc. And what the participant had to do is to rate how successful the person in the photograph is. Okay, and then He found out that people who were told that they did well on the intelligence test are more likely to see success in photographs of people doing various tasks. That's the origin of what we call Rosenthal effect in psychology. Okay, so you will encounter that when you go to industrial and organizational psychology. Now, this study looks promising. However, there is one thing that affects the objectivity of Rosenthal in this experiment. And what is that? Let's take a look at this. Do you think Rosenthal's knowledge on who was in which group influenced his observation? If you are Rosenthal and you know that group A is the successful group and group B is the group that will be told that they have done poorly, do you think that will affect your analysis of the data? Well, there's a chance that it will make you bias in your conclusions because there is what we call self-fulfilling prophecy. This phenomenon, this is a statement that affects events to cause the prediction to become true. In other words, there are some instances wherein, as a researcher, you become biased in your conclusions because you will do everything that will confirm your hypothesis so that your study can be published, so that you can say that your hypotheses are correct. Okay, so we would like to avoid self-fulfilling prophecies by being more objective in our approach, in our manipulation, by applying some of the interventions I told you earlier, like having a double-blind or single-blind study, so that we can be more objective in how we observe the participants in our research and also in how we analyze their data. Now, so in other words, even when we are being careful, if the researcher is aware of the hypothesis, he or she may unconsciously act differently or unintentionally affect the behavior of these participants. Okay, so sometimes it helps if you will hire some research assistants who know nothing about the background or rationality of the study so that they will not be biased in the way that they administer the manipulation to the participants. So now let's take a look at the different ways to measure psychological variables. How do we quantify behavior? So one thing that we can use is a measure. So what is a measure? These are tools or techniques that assesses thoughts, behaviors, even emotions, feelings. And a measure can be self-report. When we say that a measure is self-report, it means that the person or the participant himself will be the one who will answer the survey. So that's a self-report. For example, look at this image below. I can always manage to solve difficult problems if I try hard enough. So on the scale of not at all true to exactly true, how much do you agree with that statement? So that's a self-report measure. There are also other approaches in measuring variables that does not require self-report. In example, let's take a look at the next slide. We can use behavioral measures. So instead of asking the person to fill up a survey questionnaire, a psychologist can observe a child if he or she will become angry, frustrated, aggressive, etc. Sometimes this is used in instances wherein self-report will not be possible or self-report is not the best option. For example, children are not so good in filling up self-report questionnaires. So behavioral measure will be the more appropriate way to measure these variables. And lastly, we have what we call physiological measures. Like what I told you earlier, sometimes we can measure biomarkers like heart rate, blood pressure, etc. to determine if there's an increase in anxiety, activity in the amygdala, etc. And then when we have the data, we are now ready to make sense of the data. We are now ready to report the data. In other words, we make use of statistics to analyze, interpret, and present the data in a numerical form. And just a brief recap of some important terms in statistics. Let's take a look at these. So first, we have what we call descriptive statistics. When we say that that statistical approach is descriptive, it means that we are merely describing the sample. Okay, we're not dealing with the population. And some descriptive statistics are here. I guess you're familiar with them already. Mean, median, and mode, and of course, the standard deviation. And of course, we should not forget that the normal distribution is important in statistics because most of the time, okay, we use the normal distribution in order for us to understand if the individual is average, above average, below average, or if he or she is an outlier. So we will have more of this when we go to intelligence or IQ. I use IQ as an example here for me to show you that the average IQ, according to Wechsler IQ score, is 100. They say that people who finish college are more likely to have an IQ of 110. So it means that if you finish college, you're slightly higher or you're in the average range, but you're in the right part, or you're in the slightly higher than the average. Okay? Gifted individuals tend to have IQ higher than 130. So if your IQ is 130 or higher, you tend to be classified as gifted. You're in the right side. But if your IQ is 70 and below, then it means that you may have some difficulty keeping up with your peers when it comes to intelligence. You may be a bit slow for your age, or you may need extra attention in education, etc. You may need um, a different way to be educated. You may need some additional interventions. In abnormal psychology, you will learn that if your IQ is 70 or below, that is one criteria in having an intellectual disability. Okay, so if your IQ is lower than 70, it means that you will be needing more intervention for you to keep up with your peers. You may need some assistance in day-to-day behaviors, such as taking a bath, eating, etc. But if your IQ is closer to 70, it means that even though you have some difficulties in cognition, then you will still be able to perform some behaviors that you need to survive, or the activities of daily living. Okay? Now, a refresher on some inferential statistical treatments that we use. We have the t-test. So the t-test is used when we are differentiating two groups, while the ANOVA is also a comparative test, but this is used when there are three or more conditions. These two are tests of differences, but on the other hand, we have tests of relationship. Correlation allows you to know if allows you to see the relationship of two variables. If one variable increases, will the other variable increase as well? And if you have mastered correlation, you will now be ready to proceed to regression. It's an extension of correlation. It allows you to predict the value of the DV from a certain value of the IV. So in this course, you will see a lot of studies utilizing treatments from these four tools that I showed in this slide. So you need to be familiar about how to draw conclusions from t-test, from ANOVA, etc. Now let's talk shortly about research ethics. Okay, so once again, ethics talks about the rules governing the conduct of person or group in general in a specific situation, or simply standards of right and wrong in a given profession. Like we have the code of ethics for from the American Psychological Association, the Psychological Association of the Philippines, guiding our practice as psychology professionals. And the code of ethics will tell us about what to do and what not to do in certain situations. And in this case, let's take a look at some things that we need to remind ourselves of when doing research. So let's try to avoid the following scientific misconducts. First, we have what we call plagiarism. Let's avoid presenting words or ideas of other people as if they're our own ideas. That's plagiarism. Avoid falsification. Do not try to manipulate your data just so that your hypothesis will be supported. And let's avoid fabrication. Our conclusion must not come from fabricated data. Okay, the data should not be made up. It should come from data analysis and not fabricated information. Now let's talk about ethical treatments of participants. First, remember that we need informed consent. They must know what are the pros and cons of participating in a study. They should know that they have the right to back out of a certain study if they want to, if they're uncomfortable. They should know the purpose of the study, etc. Respect for persons. We must not expose our respondents to any type of harm. We should avoid anything that may cause any discomfort to our participants. If there will be some sort of discomfort, then they must be knowledgeable about it ahead of time. Beneficence, we should do good to our participants. Let us try our best to avoid harm, and let's try our best to compensate the person if he or she will be feeling some sort of discomfort during the course of the study. Privacy and confidentiality. If the person does not want to reveal something about himself or herself, we should respect that. And we should not publicize the names of the participants in our study. And then lastly, justice. We should not try to do something such as intervention, experiment. If we do not know anything about that field, let us make sure that all our participants will receive the same kinds of treatment. We should make sure that we have the right training to conduct a certain study or to conduct a certain intervention. And those are the things that we need to remember when we are dealing with human participants. Okay, so that is for your refresher of psychological research, its purpose, types of psychological research, objectivity in research, and ethics in research. And then along the way in this course, you will see a lot of research, and these studies will help us understand more about the different concepts that we are going to talk about. Okay, so I hope you learned a lot from this topic.